am Amy Vetter, and welcome to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. This valuable time is for you to pause in your day and go on your own self-journey. Discover the beliefs that are holding you back from living your best life at work and at home. Learn from the guests on this show as they share their inspirational stories on how they found ways to break internal beliefs that were no longer serving them. Because if you believe you can, you will. And our podcast begins now. In this episode of the Breaking Beliefs podcast, I interview Samantha Moe of Mad to Glad Parent Coaching and Dr. Tye Moe of Whole Family Chiropractic. Samantha and Tye equip parents with information and tools to lead their families with less worry and more ease. And they also help parents make sense of behavior and health struggles and guide them in ways to action and turn things around. So you may wonder, why are we talking about children? Well, that's because we start our belief systems as a child and the environments that we create. And those start driving into our adulthood. So what we discuss on this podcast is how to have a positive effect on our overall health as adults and help us to create a better environment, whether at work or at home. I am so excited for my discussion today with Samantha and Tye Moe. And so just to get started, I would love for the two of you to just give a little bit of background on yourself, what you do today, before we start getting into the conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
So happy to be here with you, Amy.
Well, we love having you.
Thank you. So I am a certified parent coach here in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I work nationally over Zoom. So really working with families to help them make sense of their child's challenging behaviors and shift their own parenting approach so that their kids become better listeners and they have positive connections at home.
Great.
And I am a neurological chiropractor also in St. Paul, Minnesota here. And we work with the whole family to help their nervous system connect so their brain can talk to their body and their body can get good, positive, clear messages into the brain. So we commonly help kiddos struggling with anxiety, ADHD, sensory issues, poor sleep, calm their brain, and then also help their body function better so they have a stronger immune system, better digestion, natural ways to help heal the body.
So just to explain to our listeners why you guys are on today and why I'm so excited to interview you is in the whole Breaking Beliefs podcast, and our mission is really to talk about how a lot of these beliefs internally get developed as we're children. And we take it into adulthood. It affects us in the workplace. It affects how we interact in our families and so forth. And one thing that I've definitely found as a yoga studio owner is the sooner we can get children in to start learning coping skills and those sort of things, we start training the mind so that once we're in adulthood, even if you stop along the way, you're like, oh, I remember that moment that I felt a little bit calmer, that what was I doing, and those sort of things. So I just thought it was really important to have this discussion because as adults, we can't go back to being kids, and nor would we want to. But it's important to kind of understand how we got here and what are tools that you work with children with. How do we help our children so we don't repeat the same patterns? And then how do we help ourselves to break from those patterns? So I would love to start today with just what led you, what's your story? Like, how did you get into this field in the first place, and the belief systems that either you broke to be in the kinds of occupations you're in, or is it things that you always had?
Yeah, definitely. So myself, I grew up in a strict and conservative family in a suburb in Minnesota, and there were 7 people in my family, and I was always a pleaser. So the 4th child out of 5, I wanted a lot of harmony in the family, but that also meant that I didn't really develop a strong voice until I was in my later 20s. And in fact, I saw the evidence of this really deep internal stress of not knowing how to speak about the stress I was experiencing in my family, because the winter of my 10th grade year, so my sophomore year of high school, I would wake up, it was still dark outside, cold winter, and I would go upstairs to make breakfast. And as I would put the bread in the toaster, about the same time every morning, the room would start going black. And I could still hear like my dad listening to the radio because he was always up to drive me to high school.
Mm-hmm.
But I had these blackout episodes that later I learned were panic attacks because of internalized anxiety. So fast forward to my graduate schooling at the University of Minnesota in 2004, when I graduated in communication disorders. The reason I chose that path is because I understood what it felt like to be a really closed in kid, where I looked a certain way on the outside, which was like I looked like accomplished. I got my master's degree by the time I was 21 years old. But the stress internally was so deep that I decided to work with kids who had autism so I could really draw them out and help to reveal their gifts.
So let me just pause on that story a little bit, because there's moments in that decision process, I'm sure, where how did you even admit or identify to yourself that this is happening?
Oh, yeah. So how old are you in 10th grade? I was about 15 years old. I didn't know that was happening when I was 15. I realized it when I was 27 years old and working with a life coach. And she was talking to me about the anxiety that I was feeling in my work environment as a speech pathologist. I was making great progress with kids, but I would find myself at lunchtime going out into my car to kind of hide and take a nap, to have enough energy to get through the day, because I was in like so much stress all the time.
Yeah.
So the life coach, I sought her out to help me sort through like, how do I enjoy my work again?
Right. And so those are hard things to admit that are happening in our life, especially when we're trying to project something else forward. So when you were choosing that path, was it because of what you saw the life coach did for you? Or so how did you make that decision?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I saw that kids were under a lot of stress, and obviously I had a heart for that. I wanted to solve that problem in my own life.
Yeah.
Then I would be working with a parent of, let's say, a 4-year-old who had autism, and I'd be teaching them ways that their child could calm their meltdown, and they could learn language skills to say, I love you, or make friends so that they could have a play date. And I had like this great plan for them, and the parent would come into my office and they'd say, Samantha, I can't get my kid to do that. I'm so exhausted and I don't know how to get my kid to listen.
Right.
Like what you're asking for, it feels impossible.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's really hard because we might set out in our life to do certain things or to accomplish certain things. And then there's those moments where you start listening intuitively to yourself of, this is the path I'm going to go, right? Because
exactly,
it's a bigger purpose. So Tye, what about you? What led you to be doing what you do today?
Yeah, so when you just mentioned, we sometimes set out on a certain path and then we change course. Myself, it was always being holistically minded. When I was in elementary school, we lived in the country in a log home on 40 acres. So I spent all my days playing outside, running around the woods, and like really kind of becoming in tune with nature. And going to school, I loved then learning how the human body worked. And I remember in anatomy lab and physiology lab and all these things, it'd be dissecting rats and guinea pigs and worms and birds, and just loving to learn how any body worked. And so looking into different healthcare options, and I actually toured the chiropractic school here in Minnesota in the Twin Cities. And one of the doctors talked about helping a boy with asthma. And I thought, how could that even be possible? And he was explaining how when the brain is controlling everything in the body, all the messages are going down the spinal cord. And as they go down the spinal cord, they actually leave little nerve channels, go to all the body parts. And what he was saying is that he actually put up an x-ray and said, for this boy, as a teenage boy, he's had asthma for years, inhaler for years, this part of the spine here in the upper back, those nerves go to his lungs. And he showed on the x-ray that part of his spine was off, leading to his asthma. He started adjusting him, and all of a sudden the boy got off his inhaler and his asthma went away. And I thought, whoa, that is some amazing potential for the body to heal itself when it can work normally. And that really opened my eyes to the power that chiropractic can bring to the healing.
And was this something that you had seen as an example in your family to go in a career path like this?
To some degree, my aunt and uncle are chiropractors. So I
Yeah.
was aware of the field, but I never like sat down and had this conversation with them. So it really didn't open my eyes till I was able to be at that tour.
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting how it would have taken the courage from such a different lifestyle that you lived in to put yourself out there to go down this path. What gave you the confidence to do it? What do you think?
That's a great question. And because one of the things that for myself, I've always been pretty withdrawn and not really the go-getter, the like put myself out in these vulnerable situations. It lived in a really small town. And then
Right.
my undergrad was in Green Bay. So it's like a little bit bigger. And then all of a sudden chiropractic school's in the Twin Cities, which is way bigger. And the biggest thing when we talk about beliefs here, it was, as I look back, it was probably my mom just saying like, you're smart, you're intelligent, you're going to go to college, you're going to get a good job, you're going to do well. And looking back, there were times where from the outside, other people might have thought, oh, it could go either direction. But I just remember that belief was so firmly ingrained at a young age. It's almost like I didn't have a choice. It was
Yeah.
like, these things are going to happen no matter what.
Yeah. And I think, so Samantha and I have talked before about the ACE study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And really that kind of feeds into what you're talking about from the reverse side, right? So for those of you that don't know about this study is about adverse childhood experiences we have as children that end up affecting us throughout our life. And one of the biggest things that came out of that study was the difference between having a safe, nurturing environment versus people that don't, and the disease that it causes and so forth in your life, which is why the two of you meld so well together with what you do. But also that in order to change an environment, to change the energy that you're putting out there, when you create a safe, nurturing environment, people respond in different ways. It doesn't have to be your parent, you know, in your example it was, but not necessarily. It's more this environment we create. So how have you seen this in play with children that you work with, and maybe even seeing it in play with the family, and what the parents have had to do to change in order to affect the trauma that a child's going through?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the reasons that we're on this podcast together is that we're both have that same end goal in mind. We want to provide great experiences for kids to help them have that brighter future. And we talk a lot about how Samantha's work is looking at the outside in. So she's
Right.
looking at that external environment, just like you were talking about, that we see with the ACEs piece, is these adverse childhood experiences, these events that are on the outside that cause a neurological change on the inside. And
Right.
so then in our office, rather than the outside in approach, we're looking at the inside out approach. And we actually have scans, neurological scans that can measure how the nervous system is working. Is it in a stress mode, or is it in a calm, safe mode? Are there stresses stuck along different areas of the nervous system, along the spine, or are things working properly?
And we have a lot of examples, like specifically for the listeners. Like, I mean, if you think about a child who has a traumatic experience, so, you know, things that might involve death, or that involve injury, or that involve abuse or neglect, like it's really obvious to think like, well, of course, trauma is going to affect you adversely. But what we also see is that things that create really significant stress in children and make them feel unsafe and develop these beliefs that they're not good enough, or they should be afraid of other people, that that also can lead to something like heart disease when they're 40 years old. So an example that I'll share of this for maybe the average listener is that it's not just like crazy abuse or neglect situations that impact how you show up as an adult or in the workplace, or your own, how you operate in terms of your mental well-being. But like in my family, I grew up in a very fundamentalist religion. So while we were all really closely connected, when I started my business 7 years after working in the field of autism so that I could help families of children with all types of diagnoses, I realized that I was kind of afraid of connecting with people that I didn't know, like people who weren't in my immediate community, because I kind of developed, I was, not to blame preachers or teachers or parents. And yet as a kid, those are how our beliefs are formed, those influential adults. And so like I had to really do a lot of self-talk and meditation practice around feeling safe with people, because otherwise, how do we connect with them? How do we really be of service in the world?
Absolutely. So just like I'm older now, but at 32, I kind of went through that same phase myself and was in deep therapy almost 3 hours a week, putting myself through it to deprogram the messages that were in my head as well. And I didn't even realize that, because I think as we grow up, we so I'm, by the time I was going to therapy, I was still thinking as my 16-year-old brain, right? Like I was still viewing it from that perspective until I started having children. And I was like, wait, that doesn't seem right. So I started feeling off internally and creating that awareness of, well, is that what I'm going to follow because that's what I was taught? Or, breaking free from it is really hard work. So when you're working with parents, that like one of the things, so I'm writing a book on this. This is how we started getting to know each other on this topic. But one of the things that I talk about in my book is like second generation Holocaust survivors, where this syndrome actually applies to all kinds of trauma, where someone else is living out the pain of the generation before them and before them and before them. And if they break away from it, then how guilty they feel, or they're looked at as a deserter and so forth. So when you're dealing with parents, because you're dealing it with from both perspectives, in order to help a child, we've talked about creating a safe, nurturing environment, but in order to do that, the adult actually has to break free from their belief systems. And you can help from a therapy perspective and you can help from a medical perspective, but if the environment doesn't change, it's very hard to help the child. So what do you do with the adult side of this?
Yeah, so good. Well, first of all, like, I don't know if this sounds cheesy or whatever, but we always start with love and non-judgment.
Yes.
Because if we start
not cheesy.
Of course, you're a yoga teacher. And non-judgment is key, because we all have programming that kind of separates us from other people. So we want to understand that humans are humans, and if we can lead them to their own potential and reflect that to them, they have an opportunity to step into that level. So for myself, like Tye was saying, working on the outside in. So when I'm working with parents and their kids having meltdowns and disrespectful behavior and cursing or getting kicked out of school, all these different things, the place that I start with them is I start asking transformational questions. So questions are designed, what your brain does when you ask a question is it wants to find the answer to a question. So for example, I might ask a parent in the first session, what's challenging at home? And so they'll say things like, well, my kid's having meltdowns and they won't go to bed at night, and that's why I'm here, which is very surface level. Like you might say that to your friend, but then I'll ask them, and what does that feel like? Right. And parents will often say things that they preface with, well, I feel like the worst parent for saying this out loud, but if I were to be honest, I love my kid and I don't like them. Or they'll say things like, I sit in my car at the end of the day trying to convince myself to walk across the threshold of our front door because I don't even want to go home at night.
Wow.
And when we can begin admitting the things that are really challenging for us and what that feels like for our human experience. Now we have this opening that we can ask more of a desire question. Like, well, what do you want to feel instead? Well, I want to feel energized, and I want to have peace of mind, and I want to feel like it's fun to be a parent. So these transformational questions start opening up new potential for parents, so that we can plug things in to say, if you want that, here's the path to get there, tactically speaking.
Right. And you also don't know if that child's reminding them of some relative that affects them adversely, because, right, these personality traits kind of flow through too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to kind of nudge you a little bit here, because I keep hearing like, oh yeah, epigenetics. We got to talk about epigenetics, because you're talking about second generation and how we can carry trauma through our genes, even though the second generation hasn't physically experienced that environment. And so sometimes that's what we're doing when parents are like, my kid was intense from day one. And they're trying to figure it out, like, am I a bad parent? Is this the chicken or the egg? And so we've got this epigenetic thing going on that chiropractic is really good at, like turning off some of those switches that are creating stress and sending signals back up to create kids' behaviors and identities.
Yeah, so sometimes we have that situation where it's day one, they were colicky and they were throwing everything up and they never slept and they're crying all the time and they didn't nurse and all these things. And what we'll see in those situations, oftentimes there's something in the birth process, maybe in the pregnancy, in the prenatal period, that these stress signals are starting to get flipped on in that little baby. And for example, the birth process is a lot of stress on the neck, and the neck actually has a huge amount of either calm or stress into the brain. So we'll see a child, we had a family come in recently, 30 hours of labor, and the child wasn't progressing because they were transverse. So each contraction, baby was just bending, ended up with a C-section and a ton of stress going on here, creating what happens when that's off is actually locking in the fight or flight response in that child's brain. So all of a sudden, this fight or flight's going, and parents don't know why. They think, oh, he was born with that, she was born with that. And that's one of the things that we look to do then, is reset those patterns on the inside, to then, if we can get that child out of that chronic fight or flight, then the external environmental changes can have a deeper impact.
So as the adult in this situation, because I take this from the perspective of, we want to be better for the people around us, whether at home or at work. And a lot of times, kind of what you're referring to with even your children. And I would probably say, you know, my first son that was born, it was very traumatic. He was a preemie. And I didn't feel like we were bonding right away. Like because there was so much stress happening, the wires everywhere, apnea monitors. And I kept going, I'm good. This is okay. Like, you know, cause you're just, you know, trying to get through it. But, and where you're thinking like, well, maybe the baby's never going to love me. Maybe and he's like one of my best friends now, you know, at 18 years old. But I think we have a tendency, you know, like you were using the example of like, my kid's always been bad, or, and so forth. But we do this in the workplace a lot too, where we blame other people for the experiences that we're having, rather than stepping back and going, what is my place in this experience? How am I affecting this? And which of these patterns and behaviors that came from me through childhood trauma, because everyone's had something, right? Maybe not, but for the majority of people through the research, you know, many have, I think it's 4 or more ACEs. It's like 67% of people, which is the adverse childhood experiences, which means ACE. And the thing about it is, when we find ourselves in these situations, we start repeating behavior in adulthood, whether that be leaving jobs or certain repeated arguments we get in, or frustrations and so forth. So what do you do to help people identify that? So besides the experience that the baby or the child had, how does the adult identify what they're bringing into that experience as well?
Yeah, really good question. So I want to share something before, how do we help the adult identify? And that is, just by having direct conversation and hearing what the experience is like. So in the workplace, people might say like, oh, interacting with my colleagues is always a drag. There's always so much drama.
Right.
And what they might not understand until this conversation is that they're actually seeking drama because their nervous system is wired more in fight or flight from a younger age. And so, it's for us modeling a new perspective, and the perspective is one of 100% responsibility. So the things that are happening in your life, let's look at this from a perspective of how are you contributing here?
Yes.
And then the other,
which is so hard.
So hard. Oh yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's something to really, I want to kind of reinforce. It's really hard to take 100% of the blame, because as soon as you do, you go, yes, but there was still this. And there was still the thing that they did. But if you are not doing that self-fulfilling prophecy of justifying, right? And you go to the place of like, well, what is my place in it? And you model different behavior the next time, how could that change the experience? So I just wanted to reinforce what you said there, because it's really important for the workplace, especially.
Absolutely. And and that's why Tye and I both love the nervous system and how the brain works, and us talking to you, Amy, about beliefs is because, like, a concrete example, and I'll let everybody think about how they could apply this in their workplace, but a concrete family example that's going to seem really obvious, but we don't think of it in the moment, is if a child is screaming at their parent and saying things that a parent never wants to hear from a child, like, what some of those things are. And I ask a parent, well, how do you respond? And they say, well, I started yelling at them. And I'm like, you can't treat me that way. That's disrespectful. But if we take a step back and we say, well, what was going on in the child? Did you know that your child is yelling because their nervous system is in fight or flight? And so I call that fire in the brain. And I say, so what do you think adds to the fire? And what do you think puts out the fire? And immediately they're like, oh, I shouldn't be yelling.
Right.
Or in the workplace, like, oh, so I shouldn't have sent that nasty email.
It might have felt good at the moment.
Exactly.
One thing, it's maybe a little harder line approach, but in the workplace as an employer, a lot of times I'm talking to my team about, there's this saying I heard a long time ago, you can have results or excuses, but not both. And like a simple example would be just showing up on time. And years ago, I had a team member who, it felt like 90% of the time, she couldn't find her car keys, or there was traffic, or there's construction outside her place, or her window was frozen shut, or it was like, wow, it was never her fault, even though somehow for her, 90% of the time she didn't make it on time to our meeting.
Right.
And it made me realize that the other saying that I teach my team is, how you do anything is how you do everything. And so as the boss, as the manager, as the employer, like, I can't justify, ooh, that's a good excuse, that's not a good excuse. I just have to look at the patterns and what are the tendencies. And guess what? If you're showing up on time most of the time, a few things pop up, I'm not going to worry about it. And so just really understanding that, like, what you do, the actions you take, the self-responsibility that you take is going to be the biggest thing that impacts everything else.
Yeah. And I think that's important. And I would love to hear some examples that you've done yourself as a couple or at work where you've applied this yourself, because one of the things that I think as a leader, or even as a parent, is to not treat everyone equally. That not everyone comes from a different place, different trauma, different patterns of behavior. And when she's forgetting her keys every week, and then every time she walks in, you make sure to make a face so that everybody knows, it creates stress in the room for everybody else, right? Like, and it's the same thing with our children, that children are different. They have different temperaments. They have different emotional needs, and how do you shift and pivot for that? And so what are some things that you've had to do to change yourselves based on the knowledge that you have, to be able to better respond at home or at work, that have helped you?
Yeah, I've got a quick answer to that one. So for me, because I had this belief of being afraid of people, I realized that my self-talk when I was in a challenging situation was, I would say things like, "Oh, I hate that person," in my head. And I don't want to say it out loud, but I'm sure there are other people who have that self-talk too. So I got the free Insight Timer app. And for a solid year, I committed to setting it for 5 minutes every single morning. And I sat facing out the window so I could feel the sun as it was rising in the morning. And I literally only tuned into what is the sensation of love. Because if I come from my regular patterning of being afraid of people or rejecting them first because I'm afraid of them, I'm going to be in a bad spot and not able to help.
You know, that's a really interesting observation. I was listening to Oprah's podcast, and I wish I could remember the name of the guy. I'll look it up. But he was talking about when they've done research on people meditating, the majority of people are wishing bad things on other people.
Oh,
Wow.
Yeah, which is interesting. When you're taking those moments and you're letting the anger come out rather than, you know, coming to a place of peace or shifting those thought processes. It really hit me when he talked about that. And it's kind of the same thing we do with self-talk, is how do we become aware of it so that we don't show up in the way that we don't want, you know, in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
What about you, Tye?
So my example is growing up, while I had a very loving environment, for whatever reason, I was always very afraid of what others were thinking of me. So afraid of others in a different way, like, were they judging me? Are they criticizing me? What are they thinking of me? Being afraid of rejection, basically.
So what would make you think they were judging you or what type of things did you think they were judging you on?
How I looked, what I was wearing, what I was saying. Am I smart enough? There was a point where in 7th grade, I had moved towns because my parents had been divorced. And so I was in a new town, new students, new everything. And I was trying to make friends, but not very social. So like, oh man, no matter what happens, I got to start making friends. And I was in math class and Mrs. Knox asked us a question. And I remember my neighbor, Dustin, he raises his hand, she calls on him, he answers, she's like, nope, sorry, that's not right. So I raise my hand. She goes, yes, Tye. And I answer correctly. And she goes, yep, you got it. And I was pretty smart in math. So I'm like, yeah, I knew that answer. And all of a sudden I had this thought hit me like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be making friends here. Like, I shouldn't be a know-it-all. And all of a sudden everything like shut down and went inward because I was so afraid of, like, that's not how you make friends, is by showing people up. And so really that for me was a really pivotal moment.
So how do you practice that today? How have you changed that, I guess, today to feel good about speaking up?
As a realization a couple of years ago, looking at the nervous system and especially unconscious patterns, I was realizing the self-defense mechanism that I created was, well, if I'm worried about you judging me, if I can find something that's a little bit off or that I don't like about you or a weak point in you, like just in case you come criticizing me, I'll have that as ammunition. And so even though I'm like, I love people and I get along with them really well, what I was finding is that was my first impression of someone, is looking for something that was wrong with them.
Right.
And as soon as I realized this, I realized like, well, now if I'm meeting someone, I'm not leading with an open heart. I'm not leading with love. And as soon as that hit me, I actually dedicated a full year. And what I did is I set a goal for 5 days a week, 5 people a day. I would, for the first few months out of the year, I actually, as soon as I looked at someone, I would say, okay, what's something positive about you? What do I like your hair? Do I like your smile? Do I like what you're wearing, whatever it is? And so I did that. Then the next few months I said, okay, what's something in you that I wish I had in me? And the next few months I said, well, what's something in you that I'm grateful for? And then the last few months I said, all right, what's something in you that's actually the same in me? And so I started
nice.
building these like instant connections so I was leading with love and openness and something I liked about a person. And that really shifted my energy around it.
Well, and I think that really is important as far as you have to train your brain to think positively, right? To not wish bad on other people,
Right.
or to be, you know, we're all in our own journeys, and realizing everyone's got their own experiences, and how we meet each of those people is a very individual connection. So yeah.
And now it's the funniest thing in our relationship, because whenever we go out to eat for date night or whatever, the server comes up to us and Ty's like paying really close eye contact with them, like really present, and he'll turn to them when they present, even handing the waters, and he makes sure to say hello, like full smiles, dimple out and everything. The server's like, they're not sure what to do because he's like so loving all the time.
That's so funny. Yeah, we don't know what to do with someone nice, right? That's awesome. All right, so I'm going to ask you some rapid fire questions that I ask all the guests. And so each of you can pick a category. So you pick a category between family and friends, money, spiritual, health. So Samantha, which one do you want to do?
Since we talked so much connection, let's talk about money.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so things or actions that I don't have that I want with money.
I would like a bigger house because we live in a condo, because then we could have a home birth in a year or two.
Oh, well, there you go. Okay. All right, things or actions I do have that I want with money.
Things I have materialistically, I just got a wetsuit to go kiteboarding in North Carolina, so I'll be warm.
Oh, how fun. All right, things or actions I don't have that I don't want as far as money.
I do not have an updated car with Bluetooth. All of my dials are really old school, and I don't want one because my little Toyota Scion is like a jelly bean that fits in every little space.
Okay. And then things or actions that I do have that I don't want as far as money.
Yeah, I've got a really healthy draw on my line of credit right now since I'm going through rebranding.
Totally get that. All right, so Tye, you're up. Which category?
I'm going to go money as well.
Okay. All right, so things or actions I don't have that I want with money.
Something that I don't have that I want would be a registration for this 3-day golf camp. That it's going to refine my short game and really help my game.
Life will be so much better.
It's so more amazing after that.
All right, things or actions I do have that I want.
I have, regarding money, an amazing $2 bill collection that my grandma sends me on. She sends me a card and a $2 bill every day for Valentine's Day. She's been doing it for a long time.
Oh, that's so cute. That's such a Minnesota thing.
It's still happening in this year.
That's so cute. All right, things or actions that I don't have that I don't want.
Really big house payment.
There you go. Might see some conflict there. Things or actions that I do have that I don't want.
Regarding money, still some student loans that we're chipping away at.
Yeah, absolutely. So I, really came away with a lot from our discussion today, but probably the biggest thing is the open heart as we work with other people and really coming from a place of love and non-judgment. And I don't think that's something that you can just decide to do, right? Like you both talked about your journeys, especially that your journey that you talked about of trying to train your brain to do this. And so we have to realize that this is work in order to pivot the way we are at work or with our family. But any takeaways that you would like people to leave with today?
Yeah, we talked about 100% responsibility as well. And so in line with love and non-judgment, the cool thing about this talk is that there's always something you can do. If that's our topic, like you can always refine your own love and non-judgment, or find a practitioner or a life coach or somebody like that who can support you in that process if it's too hard.
Yeah. So, and I do want to plug you as well. So I know you do help parents virtually as well. So you want to talk about a little bit about what you do?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Reach out to you.
Yeah, I like guiding parents to have more peace at home, but I'm super tactical. I'm a high achiever. So I'm like, let me show you how to get it done. And once we clear emotional baggage, those things tend to unfold really smoothly. So if people want to get a hold of me, I have a free email report for parents who want to know what are the hidden landmines that I'm doing that are actually causing stress to my child. It's 10 hidden landmines. It's through my website, mad2glad.com. So that's the number 2, mad2glad.com. It's on the homepage. So if you want that free PDF, you can just click the button and caveat, most people are guessing like, oh, I might fall into 1 or 2 or 3 categories. Please don't be surprised. I don't think anybody has ever said they fall in less than 7 categories. Like it's designed to give you good information for self-reflection.
That's great. Yeah. And so all of that will be in the blog post for this episode on the breakingbeliefs.com webpage. So you'll be able to go right into the episode page, and the links to Samantha and Tye will be there, as well as if you want to follow them socially as well. So I just want to thank you both very much for being on today and sharing your knowledge. It's been great and exactly how I'd hoped. So
we loved it too. Thank you so much,
We love
Amy.
your podcast. Thank you, Amy.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'd like to take some time for some mindful moments before we rush back into our day, to really step back and take in some of the concepts that we talked about during this podcast. And some things that really stuck out to me was, first off, when Samantha talked about transformational questions that she asks parents. And I really believe this is something that we should also think about in the workplace, or if we're dealing with clients or customers, that a lot of times when we ask questions, we get a surface answer, but not necessarily dig deeper to understand how someone's feeling versus what they're thinking. And so what can we do in our life rather than passing judgment on an outward action that we may see, but instead really seek to understand with what they say is an open heart, but also non-judgment? And this is something we have to practice because it's hard. This is not the way our brains function. We immediately size people up, take in their actions or behavior, and make our own assumptions. But a lot of times we don't understand the triggers that are setting people off, which goes into our discussion about trauma. And when we've experienced trauma in our childhood, this carries into our adulthood unless we do something about it, unless we really work on it. And that was what Tye was talking about with epigenetics, that we carry trauma between the generations, whether that's passed through just through DNA or whether it's passed through different behaviors that we saw as we were growing up that started developing belief systems internally within us. That it's important to take those moments and step back as an adult rather than blaming what's happened before us or the experiences that we've happened when we were younger. What can we do now to change the future, to change how we interact with people and change that energy? And I loved their idea, which is really hard, is modeling a new perspective by taking 100% responsibility for the experiences that we're in. How could we take that into our lives and really make sure that we understand that we have full responsibility in any experience, whether it's with our employees, coworkers, or in our home life? And how do we take responsibility for what we bring into that experience? And by forcing ourselves to take 100% responsibility, what would that mean? Now, granted, we all have different situations where we can't control it, whether it's abuse or different violent situations that you absolutely have to get out of. But I'm talking about the everyday occurrences. What can we take responsibility for so that maybe we show up a little different? And that means really stepping back and pausing and meeting people where they are with an open mind, with an open heart, to make sure that when we hear an excuse for why certain things didn't get done, that we're not instantly reacting to the excuse itself, but trying to understand what created that in the first place. And one of the things that Tye said that was really important is how you do anything is how you do everything. So if we want to change how we show up, it's important that people perceive us in the way we want them to. And if we want them to perceive us as somebody that meets deadlines, as someone that's open to change, then we actually have to start working into those behaviors and taking responsibility for our own actions and how that impacts others. So there is always something we can work on. There's never any quick fix to this, and there's never any end, which I've learned. So over time, you may think, I got this, and then something else happens. But what we want to create is that awareness, that open heart, where we step back and say, you know what? I need to see what my place in this experience is, have more outside awareness of what we bring into each situation and how we can continually try to strive to do better. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. I hope you will take a moment to pause before entering back into your day to reflect on this podcast and note 1 to 2 actions you are inspired to do from today's conversation that you could incorporate into your life. To read the full blog and listen back to this episode or any other, you can find them at www.amyvetter.com/Breaking Beliefs podcast and related videos on my YouTube channel. For daily inspiration, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Amy Vetter CPA. I hope that you will choose to like this and subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and more so that you can join us for more inspiration on our next episode.